Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. An interview with Professor James H. Cone.
I still have a dream. Yes. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican, nor an American. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare.
From New York City by Professor James H. Cone, author of the book Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare.
Part of the dream nightmare image that I used as the main theme throughout the book on Martin and Malcolm is the fact that I think it reflects the different lives that they lived and also the different lives that African Americans live in this country pretty much. Martin himself comes from a kind of privileged situation in which he himself never had to worry about his education, and his father and his mother provided a pretty wholesome atmosphere for him to grow up in, and for him to go through college and then through graduate school to get a PhD without having to experience the worst side of America. That represents the dream. And, you know, my own life reflects something of that, but not quite as much as you find it in Martin Luther King Jr. Well, with Malcolm X, on the other hand, his life is much more difficult. His father is killed when he is just a child, only about 5 or 6 years old, and he is put in a reform school. Although he becomes a very successful student, Malcolm does, and becomes the president of his 8th grade class, yet the English teacher discouraged him from becoming a lawyer and told him that a carpentry would be the best thing for him, even though he was the brightest student in his class. So Malcolm dropped out of school at the 8th grade and then goes to Boston and then to New York, and he ends up becoming a hustler, and by the time he becomes a young adult, before he reaches the age of 21 years old, he is in prison, and he's there almost 7 years. So while Martin King was getting an education at Boston University and other places, Malcolm X was in prison. And so that's the contrast. And those contrasting lives that they live also becomes reflected in their messages. So Martin King is much more hopeful about America, while Malcolm X sees America from the perspective of one who has been in prison and who is not as hopeful. He sees America from the perspective of where the masses of poor black people see America. And that's not a dream. That's a nightmare. And that's how I chose the different themes. But the interesting thing about them is that they don't stay where they are. They learn from each other and begin to complement each other in a way that my main concern is to show that you cannot understand Black America or America in general without taking seriously both Martin and Malcolm, and not just one of them. I think if you take just one of them, you misunderstand both African Americans as well as America as a country.
We're talking with Professor James H. Cone, author of the book Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Professor Cone, can you talk, if you will, about Martin Luther King's growth coming from his background in the Southern Black Church, and then comparing and contrasting that to Malcolm X, who comes out of the tradition of the Marcus Messiah Garvey movement, correct?
Yes, mainly the Nation of Islam, but the Nation of Islam was influenced by the Garvey movement.
Correct.
Let me just say a word about both. Martin King, of course, comes out of the integrationist Black Baptist tradition in the in Atlanta, Georgia, in the South. I grew up in Arkansas, so I have something of the idea of the kind of situation in the South that Martin King grew up in. He was Baptist, I am AME, so I have something of similarity between them. Martin King's father was the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, a very prominent church in Atlanta, Georgia, and therefore being the son of a pastor and going in the ministry when he was only 19 years, 17, 18 years of age, Martin King goes off to graduate school in Pennsylvania, to Crozer Theological Seminary, and then to Boston University, where he received his Ph.D. degree. That kind of heritage gives you something of the sense of Martin King's perspective on life and something of the privilege that he had. What is interesting about King is that even though he had that privilege, he chose to make solidarity with people who didn't have privilege. He acted against his own privilege and chose to make solidarity with the little people of the world. And that's what's so great about Martin King. But yet at the same time, his privilege also gave him the belief that there was hope. And he got that from the Christian gospel, a gospel that emphasizes that there's a reason to believe that God will empower people to struggle for justice, and that no matter how difficult the ways of the world might be, God can empower people to struggle against it. King embodied that, and he believed that. And that's why he could be such a dominant figure in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, on the other hand, has a different history. His is a history that comes, as you indicated, out of the Black nationalist tradition, largely defined by Marcus Garvey in the early part of the 20th century. But for Malcolm, it was the Nation of Islam, and it was Elijah Muhammad who gave him a sense of who he was. But his father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher, and he also was a follower of Marcus Garvey. So Malcolm became acquainted with Garvey by going with his father to the Garveyite meetings in Detroit, Michigan. And when Malcolm grows up and goes to prison, he encounters the Nation of Islam while he's in prison. And that tradition was influenced largely also by the Garvey tradition, because both represent a Black nationalist tradition that emphasizes that Black people will get freedom, not by primarily cooperating with white people, but by affirming their own self-determination. Now, that contrasts with Martin King, who emphasize that blacks will get their freedom largely by struggling for integration in American society and making white people live up to the principles of equality and justice that's found in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and in the Christian tradition within this land. These are the kind of contrasts that you find between Martin King and Malcolm X. See, Malcolm X comes from that nationalist separatist tradition which said that you will never get your freedom by depending upon white people or trying to integrate with them. You get your freedom largely by becoming a self-determining community on your own without having to be dependent upon white people.
As a follower and minister of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who is the messenger of Allah to the American so-called Negroes, I am very happy to accept Dr. Cowell's invitation to speak here this evening at the Abyssinian Baptist Church and to express, or at least try, to represent the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's views on this most timely topic, the Black Revolution.
Yes, sir.
First, however, there are some questions that we have to put to you. Since the black masses here in America are now in open revolt against the American system of segregation, will these same black masses turn toward integration, or will they turn toward complete separation? Will these awakened black masses demand integration into the white society that enslaved them, or will they demand complete separation from that cruel white society that has enslaved them? The black masses don't want to integrate. The masses want to separate. We don't want segregation, nor do we want integration, but we want complete separation. In short, we don't want to be segregated by the white man. We don't want to be integrated with the white man. We want to be separated from the white man.
A great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
We're talking with Professor James H. Cone, author of the book Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Professor Cone, certainly the nationalist versus integrationalist viewpoints of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, respectively, was a factor that would keep them from being able very easily to come together to agree on a strategy, correct?
Yes, it did. In fact, for much of the period of their lives, they knew about each other. Because when Martin King graduates from college, from Boston with a PhD degree, leaves Boston almost having finished his PhD degree, and goes down to Montgomery, Alabama, and later to lead that Montgomery bus boycott. Malcolm X was just getting out of prison in 1952. And what is interesting is that Martin King becomes a dominant figure in the civil rights movement after the Montgomery bus boycott. And so Malcolm X knows about him. But by the beginning of the 1960s, Martin King also knows about Malcolm X. And by the 61, 62, 63, 64, they are engaging each other through the media. And Martin King wants to create a sense that blacks and whites can get along together and build the beloved community here in America. But Malcolm X helps him to see that is not as easy as he thought it was going to be. In fact, he says on one occasion, he said, while Dr. King was having a dream in Washington, D.C., the rest of us Negroes are having a nightmare in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. So that contrast is one that is pretty dominant in their lives. They respected each other, and they learned from each other. They met only one time. And the reason they didn't meet more than that just one time is because King did not feel that he could be with Malcolm X and also receive support from the white community, because the white community had demonized Malcolm X and made him appear as a person who was for separation in some kind of negative sense. But Malcolm X's point is that I'm not for separation and I'm not for integration. What I am for is freedom. That and that alone.
Malcolm X's perspective, coming from the black nationalist movement, born out of the Garvey movement, was something that white America had really no idea of what was happening regarding that perspective in the black community, correct?
That is exactly right, because, white Americans had assumed that all black people wanted to be integrated with them. And so they had prevented blacks from being integrated, being accepted in America as equal citizens, just like everybody else. Then along comes the black nationalists and an articulate spokesman like Malcolm X, who says, "I don't want to integrate with you. I just want my rights. I just want my own separation. You are a devil. I don't want to integrate with you. Why would I want to integrate with you?" And that shocked them. They didn't know what to do with that, because they had assumed that all black people wanted to be around them, wanted to integrate with them, and that freedom meant not being around white people. And Malcolm X, an articulate spokesperson who lectured at Harvard 3 times and at Yale, Princeton, and at all the major universities, debated white scholars in these universities and held his own there, even though he only had an 8th grade education, that stunned them. And therefore, they didn't know what to do with a group of black people who didn't want to integrate with them. And they then began to try to demonize and make black nationalism appear to be something that was deranged and silly and stupid. But Malcolm was so articulate that it was difficult to make Malcolm appear that way.
Part of Malcolm's difficulty in becoming more than the statesman that he already was for many blacks in America was his almost in some respects blind allegiance to Elijah Muhammad, correct?
Yes, it was. You see, but you have to understand that it wasn't so blind as you might put it. It wasn't so blind because Malcolm was uncomfortable being in the Nation of Islam, certainly by the beginning of 1961 and 62. But you see, Elijah Muhammad had been the one who take him while he was in prison and to rescue and to save him and to give him a sense of himself. See, Malcolm's father died when he was only 6 years of age. And that meant that Malcolm never had a father figure. He never had anybody to look up to. He never had anybody to care for him. Therefore, it was a psychological attachment to Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm's commitment to something was always deep. And when he made it, he really meant it. And he made a commitment to Elijah Muhammad because while he was in prison, it wasn't Christian ministers who came to rescue him. It was Elijah Muhammad. And so that kind of salvation which he experienced with Elijah Muhammad, not only getting him out of prison, but also giving him a platform in which to stand and to articulate and to become a self-educated person who could address the evils in this society. This is something nobody else had given to him. Now, if he suddenly realizes that this same Elijah Muhammad also has other kind of very serious problems and did not believe the very kind of message that he had taught him, it was difficult for him to break. So it was a very painful thing for Malcolm. Therefore, Malcolm didn't just want to leave. And so it was hard for him, and that is what the dilemma that Malcolm found for himself. But mind you, Malcolm, you can see within the early literature and tapes of Malcolm, and that Malcolm had begun to realize the limits of the Nation of Islam, and that those limits disturbed him. So eventually, Malcolm was put out of the movement, and then Malcolm, you see the real Malcolm X. You see the Malcolm X that has a broad perspective, and you see no more blind allegiance.
We're talking with Professor James H. Cone, author of the book Martin and Malcolm in America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Professor Cone discusses Martin Luther King's involvement in the Montgomery bus boycott and how that event launched his career as a major figure in the civil rights movement.
The boycott was largely started by a group of women down there, and then the preachers came in. and took it over. It's important to know that Martin King did not select himself to be a leader. In fact, he did not want to be the leader of anything. But Martin King was selected by the Montgomery community. He was only 26 years old at the time. He was new to the community. And most of the older ministers, their own fear of what white people would do to them if they became a public figure like that, put fear in them. So they were not anxious to become the leader of this boycott. So King became the leader because he was chosen. Now, the interesting thing about that is that this successful boycott for 381 days, King's house was bombed, all threats was made against his life. In fact, King received over 40 hate calls a day while this boycott was going on. And it was a serious matter. And this success thrust King into a national and international figure. But even after the boycott was over, King didn't want to become a leader. He didn't choose anything. He, even when he went to Albany in 1961, he didn't choose Albany to go there. King didn't want to become a national leader that he became. He became that largely because he could do no other. He felt by the time of the Montgomery in 1963, he felt by this time that he could not turn away from this civil rights movement because this was a calling that had come from God. And King's whole sense of ministry was defined by the civil rights movement. And he knew all along that he would not live a very long life. Every movement that he started, he believed that he wouldn't come out of it alive.